the people who are animated by the postmodern ethos are not generally in and of themselves thoroughly possessed postmodern philosophers. First of all, they don't know enough about postmodernism or its underlying Marxism to make that claim. Imagine that the philosophy has an impetus, it has a core tendency to move in a given direction as a body of ideas, a coherent body of ideas. And then imagine that it's represented in fragments among people who find its tenets palatable. So most student radicals, for example, are not 100% committed postmodernists. They're probably only like 10% committed postmodernist. When they're not being foolish with their mob, they're out being normal people. But you get a mob together that's animated by that postmodern ethos, then the collective spirit that animates the mob has that power-seeking proclivity and that antipathy towards Western ideals that we've been discussing. I think it's what makes that different, let's say, from what was happening in the Soviet Union at the beginning of the Russian Revolution, is that there was a organized group of conspirators, Lenin at the head, whose goal was to overthrow the monarchy and to seize power. And that isn't what's happening here. There isn't an organized group of people who are getting together and saying, well, you're going to lead the assault on Western civilization and we're going to produce a new government out of the ruins. It's nothing that explicit and articulated, but the end result is much the same. And it's happening, well, I think it's already demolished the universities. So I think actually irreparably. I think whatever the universities are going to be in 15 years, especially on the humanities end, will bear almost no resemblance to what the universities are now. Right? The purpose of those so-called disciplines is to produce radical postmodern activists who will reshape the political and economic structure. In fact, that's part of the coursework. It's like, that's what they do. The discipline isn't based on the acquisition of abstract knowledge. They're activist disciplines. And, you know, I use women's studies as the core example because I think it's most obvious with women's studies, although all the ethnic gender studies, pseudo-disciplines that have emerged in the universities over the last 30 years are all bastard children of exactly the same enterprise. But even more appallingly, that ethos has moved out into disciplines that at one point had some genuine value. Anthropology, that's a good one. Sociology, social work, education. Education is done. The faculties of education are so corrupt that it's almost unimaginable. They might even be worse than, as a societal segment, they might even be worse than the women's studies groups because they've seized the educational systems. I mean, I've just been reviewing the Ontario Teachers Federation, ETFO, I think it is, EFTO, Education Federation. I'm sorry, I can't remember the acronym. Doesn't matter. It's a document that's produced by the main teachers organization in Ontario. And I've just been starting to review their curriculum for children from kindergarten to grade 8. It's pure social justice postmodernism. Jesus, they even teach kids to, here's how you interpret a book if you're a postmodernist, like a fiction book. You don't read the book and try to understand what utility might be extracted out of it to guide you in your life. That's the old system. The new system is you read the book and you analyze it in terms of whose societal position of power it justifies. So you look for who the supremacist is in the text. It could be the author, it could be the characters, it doesn't matter. You read the text as if all it does is reflect on the current corrupt power structure that obtains in current society. And that's the beginnings of literary criticism under the social justice regime. And none of this is subtle. These people have gone way beyond subtle. You know, we have social justice tribunals in Ontario. They're named that. And the educators in Ontario, the teachers, have already decided that the goal of the education system is to indoctrinate children from kindergarten into a radical postmodern, leftist, communitarian, equity-oriented ethos. That's what they're doing. They're even subsuming the teaching of mathematics and science under that umbrella. And none of this is subtle, man. You just go online and download the documents and read them. And if you read them critically and carefully, well, since I've been really looking into this, which would be since last September, really starting to look at it from a legislative and policy level, I mean, the first thing I came across was the Ontario Human Rights Commission website, which is an absolute travesty. Those people are so dangerous, it's almost, you almost can't believe it. The Ontario Human Rights Commission, it should be abolished. It's a very subversive and dangerous organization, as are the human rights tribunals. Those things are dangerous. The Ontario Institute for the Studies of Education, that bloody thing is a fifth column. The people who are producing the educators that emerge from that institute, they should be put on trial for treason. Like, it's serious stuff. And the idea that the purpose of education is to get them while they're young, you know, in kindergarten, so that this radical postmodern Marxist ideology can be so thoroughly inculcated among people when they're young that they have no chance of escaping from it. And that's what's happening in the education systems. It's unbelievable. You know, every day I come across new policy statements of this sort that make my jaw drop. It's like, as Canadians, we're so accustomed to our political system working that we don't pay any attention to it. And so when you ring the bell and say, hey, there's a problem, people think, no, there's not. This is Canada, for Christ's sake. There's no problems here. You must be insane, right? And that's the right thing for them to think. Of course, when I started talking about Bill C-16 back in October, the first wave of public response was something like, this professor is like a demagogue who's, exaggerating the danger because of his own problems and for whatever reputation might accrue to him. And the funny thing about that criticism is that was the right criticism, right? Because when someone stands up in a country that functions and says, hey guys, there's something really rotten going on here, the first thing you should do is assume that that person has gone off the rails. But the problem is that I haven't gone off the rails. That's the problem. The problem is that the problems that I'm pointing to, they're real. Like, look, I talked over the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, to I would say, you know, if you imagine Canada's top 20 journalists, mostly in print, I talked to 10 of them. They're all terrified of speaking out about such things, say, as cultural appropriation. These are the main journalists in Canada. They're already censoring themselves with regards to what they'll print, and if they don't censor themselves, their editors will. And these aren't low-level people. These are people who have massive reputations, and you'd think that would be sufficient, you'd think, to protect them from being mobbed. But they're terrified.